Is Java pass by reference or pass by value? This question, which is nearly guaranteed to come up in a technical interview, is one that's subject to a lot of debate. And probably one of the best answers I heard on this is it depends on who taught you Java. So I really like to show this through an example. Now, officially, it's passed by value, but objects are references that are passed by value, which is utterly confusing. So it's best to take a look. And why is this all important anyway? Well, this really deals with method calls. Remember what a method call is. In a method call, we are passing in parameter variables. So you see I have a variable called neon, a variable called cavalier, a variable called first trip, and a variable called second trip. And the question that we want to answer is, when I pass a variable in, and that variable holds a primitive, what happens to that variable if the variable gets reassigned in a method that we're calling? On a similar note, what happens to an object if that object is stored in a variable, I pass that variable to a method, and the method that I'm passing to reassigns reassigns that variable to a new object. Okay. Third, what happens if I pass an object in with a variable and the method does not reassign that variable, but using that original object, it calls a method on that object? Well, here's the short answer. If I pass a primitive into a method, and that method reassigns this primitive variable to a new variable, that reassignment will not change the original variable and the original calling method. If I pass a variable into a method, and that variable contains an object, and the method I'm calling reassigns that variable to a new object or different object, that will not affect the original. Now, third case, if I pass an object into a method via a variable, and the method I'm calling doesn't change the variable, it doesn't reassign it, but it does call a method on that object, then that method call will affect the original. So let's look at an example. I have a demonstration here that's based on our program we've been working with in this lecture series. And you see I'm declaring a variable called neon, and I'm initialing it to a series of tens. So 10 gallons of gas, 10 miles per gallon, 10,000 on the odometer. A cavalier, once again, I'm creating this, and I'm giving it values that begin with 20 gallons of gas, 20 miles per gallon, 20,000 miles on the odometer. Now I have two primitive variables, and we see that one of them is set to a value of 100, the other is initialized to a value of 200. I'm passing all of these variables, the two variables that can contain objects and the two that contain primitives, to a method that I haven't made yet called moveVehicles. And then afterwards, I'm printing out the value of each of these variables. Now, a side note, on the quiz, a lot of people missed a question on what would happen in this case if I have a string and then I have a variable that contains an object that follows that string, and I'm concatenating them together with a plus. What's going to happen here is it's going to invoke the toString method, which is something that we have defined that will return a string representation of a neon, as you see here, or a string representation of a cavalier, as you see here. So this is going to print out some information that says, okay, this is a cavalier or this is a neon. We'll be able to tell which is which. Let's go ahead and make this variable, this method now called moveVehicles. I'm going to Alt-Enter, and it gives me an option to create a moveVehicles method. And at this time, let's just go ahead and clear out what we have. Let's have the method do nothing and see what happens. So I save and I run, and let's take a look at our output, and we should see everything as I initialized it. So the neon with 10 gallons of gas, 10,000 on the odometer, the cavalier with 20 gallons of gas, 20,000 on the odometer. Trip 1 is 100, trip 2 is 200. Okay, now let's see what pass by value means. I'm going to take a look at a new case here, and I'm going to say first trip equals 300, second trip equals 400. Now these are primitive variables because they're not objects, they're declared with a primitive type int. And you see that we're passing in these two variables to the method. Okay, within the method, we are reassigning the variable values to 300 and 400. Let's see what happens now when we run. Your eyes aren't deceiving you. There's no difference, because you see what's happening here is because these are primitives, Java is not passing in this original variable I've declared up here. It's simply making essentially a copy of it and passing in a value 100 and 200. So changing that value down here in another method will not affect the original value in the original method called main. Okay, it's still going to be 100 and 200, even though we've reassigned it here. That will not affect the original. Variable from the original method. So let's expand this example. Let's take Cavalier, and let's assign that to a new object. Let's say Cavalier equals new Cavalier. Okay, and actually, since it's a higher level vehicle, we could even make it a Neon or a Prius. Doesn't really matter. But let's say new Cavalier, and then I'm going to say Cavalier dot set gallons of gas, and we'll say 30 because we don't have anything with 30s yet, so this will be easy to remember. Cavalier dot set miles per gallon 30. Okay, and Cavalier dot set gallons of gas, and we'll say, oh, sorry, I already did that. Let's do Cavalier dot set odometer, and we'll say 30,000. Okay, let's see how this affects the original method up above. When we print out the Cavalier here on line 31, and note that that call happens after we call this method called move vehicles. Is it going to show a Cavalier with 30, 30, and 30,000? Or is it going to show a Cavalier with 20, 20, and 20,000? Let's take a look. I save and run. And the output is still the same. Because you see what's happened here is we are assigning a brand new object to this parameter variable called Cavalier. And then what we're doing is we're setting its internal state by calling a set of setter methods, or if you prefer, a set of mutator methods with 30 and 30 and 30. But because we're reassigning it here, that does not affect the original variable that we declared in the method called main. So far we've seen a bit of consistency. A reassignment, and remember assignment means we're using an equal sign, a reassignment in a called method will not affect the variables in the calling method, okay? But let's take a look at one more case. I'm going to take my Neon here, so I have my vehicle Neon, and you see that's getting passed in. The vehicle Neon is getting passed into this method called more vehicles. Now let's not reassign the Neon, but let's do this. Neon dot set gallons of gas 40, Neon dot set miles per gallon 40, Neon dot set odometer 40,000. A very subtle but important difference here. Notice that I am not reassigning this Neon variable anywhere. All I'm doing is calling methods on the Neon variable that was passed in. So in other words, if you compare this block to this block, notice the one thing that's different is line 39 up above, we're actually reassigning the variable to a new object. But lines 44 through 46 below, we're not reassigning to a new object. We're simply dealing with the variable that contains the object that was passed into us. So let's see what happens here. It's very interesting. I'm going to right click and choose run and take a look now. Neon gallons of gas 40, odometer 40,000. Cavalier gallons of gas 20, odometer 20,000, and then the trip 1, trip 2 are still unchanged. So we see what happens here if we do not reassign a variable of an object that contains an object, but we call methods on that. What we do in those methods, if it changes the internal state of that object, that will be reflected in the calling method. Okay, so reassignment will not affect the variable in the calling method, but if we do not reassign and we simply invoke some methods, and those methods change the internal state of the object, remember state is the value of its attributes or field variables if you prefer to call them that, that will have an effect on the variables and the objects that are in the original calling method. So I realize that's a bit confusing, but I've summarized it here. Reassignment won't change original for a primitive, a variable that contains a primitive. Reassignment won't change the original for a variable that contains an object. But if we have an object and we do not reassign it within the called method, then calling a method on that object will affect the original object and the original calling method. So that's a long story, I realize, but it's a bit easier than saying yes, Java is passed by value or yes, Java is passed by reference. If you get that question, it might be worth giving the short version here, passed by value, but objects are references that are passed by value. But don't leave it at that. Go ahead and explain what I just explained in the three different scenarios that we have here. Thank you.